It is indeed a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Mr. Ian Durant, the Director of the Economics Department at the Caribbean Development Bank. Mr. Durant has done extensive research on debt sustainability and debt restructuring and has worked on policy-based loans for Caribbean countries that involved debt restructuring. Prior to joining CDB, Mr. Durant worked in the research department of the Central Bank of Barbados, and he also worked at the Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center, CARTAC, as a macroeconomic advisor, where he managed technical assistance and capacity building in the areas of macroeconomic programming and policy. And I now hand over to my colleague, Mr. Durant. Thank you.
Honorable Bridget Anisette George, MP, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Honorable Samantha Marshall Mp, Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Barbuda Affairs, Antigua and Barbuda, Senator the Honorable Christopher Coy, Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development and Investment, other presiding officers and other honorable members from CDB's boring member countries, the BMCs, Ms. Isuawa Ayahen, Program Specialist, Economic Empowerment and Statistics, UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, management and staff of the Parliament offices and of CDB, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome you to the second event in the webinar series as part of the Public Expenditure Scrutiny for MPs regional project funded by the Caribbean Development Bank. Today's webinar, What About Us? National Budgeting for Constituents, Citizens, Every Man and Child, is a platform to share and exchange collective experience with relevant and best practices, and raise issues relating to the better use of budgetary resources. Financial oversight was at the heart of the first webinar in September. The panel shared research, positive impacts of Parliament's oversight on standard of living, stability, and satisfaction with democracy. Experiences and good practices of the Public Accounts Committees and monitoring of the budget implementation, mainly by the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee, were also showcased. This triggered a number of questions from participants, indicating strong interest in further improvement of the integrity and quality of the process of approving and overseeing government expenditure. Today, we welcome you to interact with another esteemed panel on more aspects of parliamentary oversight of the budget process. Undoubtedly, you have been making several adaptations in the face of impacts from COVID-19, and we hope that you will find these webinars and other knowledge products to be very useful as you navigate through ongoing challenges. I wish to reaffirm CDB's continued commitment to supporting its boring member countries in pursuing critical success factors for development and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, such as strengthening public institutional frameworks to promote more inclusive and fiscally sound budgets and effective policy formulation and implementation that produce benefits for vulnerable groups across generations, building resilience to natural hazards and other external shocks, and promoting gender equality. It is important to keep in mind that decisions and actions taken during the budget process are critical to enhancing our ability to withstand and recover from shocks and stresses. Taking unequal exposure of some groups in society to vulnerability and risk into consideration, and generally factoring in the building of social and environmental resilience, help to strengthen the national budget to respond to critical development issues. The use of data to accurately understand risk and vulnerability is also critical to informing budget decisions. Additionally, the national budget has the capacity to help build a financially resilient future. Annual budgeting combined with well-implemented medium-term economic frameworks can provide fiscal discipline and prioritization of spending and reduction of waste. I wish to thank the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, CARICAD, and the Dodds Group Limited for again helping with the staging of another webinar. Our sincere appreciation goes out to the speakers and all who have joined this forum today. In closing, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for this event, Mr. Anthony Staden. Mr. Staden is a former lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster in London, and currently teaches current trends in parliamentary administration and public financial management courses at McGill University School of Continuing Studies in Montreal, Canada. Mr. Staden is a past Secretary General of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a stimulating session. I now hand over to Mr. Staden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Durant, for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to moderate this distinguished panel. A month ago, I listened into the first webinar on financial oversight and what is it for, and I thought the discussions were really enriching. It stressed the importance of financial oversight and the key role of MPs in monitoring and overseeing the executive in the achievement of the SDGs. Because of course, budget's not just about numbers and spreadsheets. Ultimately, budgeting is about people. And this webinar will focus on that subject, on how to bring budgets to life and ensure that no one is left behind. It will explore how parliaments can use their lawmaking and oversight powers to focus the government on establishing pro-poor and gender-sensitive budgets. Because budgetary planning and oversight and accountability requires strategies. It requires planning to achieve equality for all, men and women, boys and girls, young and old, and these all must be adequately financed. I work with Dodds Group, and I've been working on this project for a number of years. I'm currently in Antigua and Barbuda, the beautiful islands, and I would like to thank the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Barbuda Affairs for their hospitality. It's a delight to be here. We have four speakers, four very distinguished speakers, and I'd like to introduce our opening speaker now, and she is Ms. Ishua Ian. She's currently a program specialist with the UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean. She manages the agency's economic empowerment and statistic portfolios. She has over 16 years experience in international development and has served in various capacities within the United Nations systems and non-governmental organizations. Ms. Eoin has a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Minnesota's Hubert Humphreys Institute of Public Affairs and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from Swarthmore College. Ishua, we look forward to hearing your presentation. I understand you have about 6 or 7 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Sorry, I think I was muted. Thank you very much for the introduction, Mr. Staden, and all protocols observed. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the CDB and the organizers of this event for giving us an opportunity to share some insights into gender responsive budgeting. At this point, I guess I can go ahead and describe what gender responsive budgeting is. It's a government planning, program and budgeting that contributes to the advancement of gender equality And it does this by ensuring that the interventions required to eliminate inequalities between men and women and boys and girls are adequately financed. We know that when we speak about human rights, when we speak about inequalities, all of these are abstractions if the concrete actions that are needed to close these inequality gaps are not adequately financed. So in essence, that is what gender responsive budgeting is. It's a strategy to achieve social inequality, gender equality, and countries that are more gender equal rank higher on the Human Development Index, and conversely, those that are lower ranked perform poorly on gender equality measurements. So any strategy that can contribute to promoting gender equality will de facto contribute to increased national development progress, if you will. So that in a nutshell is gender responsive budgeting. I think you have some questions for me specifically, or should I continue to expound?
You can continue to expand, that's fine.
Yeah, so how can GRB enhance national development? As I mentioned before, it's critical to ensuring that these inequality gaps are closed. And also, we are speaking about governance here and transparency, and GRB leads to a transparent budget process. It's aligned with several principles of good governance, and I'll elaborate on 3 of those that I think are particularly important. One is, of course, the gender equality and women's rights. We can't have good governance without gender equality and women's rights. And countries in CARICOM have signed up to the SDGs. There's a specific indicator, 5.C.1, on gender responsive budgeting that commits member states of the UN and in the borrowing member countries of CDB to ensure that they have in place systems to track and make public allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment. So in order to achieve commitments to the SDGs, this particular SDG indicator becomes very, very critical. But what I also want to emphasize is that gender responsive budgeting is not a separate budget for women. However, because women and girls do disproportionately experience gender inequalities, and our data confirms this, our data shows that unfortunately women are the majority of victims of intimate partner violence. Poverty rates are higher in households headed by women with children. Unpaid care work responsibilities are shouldered by women disproportionately. Despite being more highly educated in CARICOM, women continue to experience higher unemployment rates. So this is evidence that we have a problem. And even though GRB is not a separate budget for women, because these gender inequalities exist, we will find that the interventions to close these gender inequality gaps have to start with promoting women's rights. So there are commitments made in policy and law to gender equality. And these will yield no results, as I said, if they are not backed by budgets. The second principle I want to emphasize is accountability and transparency. The budget itself is a law. It's a law that is passed every year in Parliament on citizens' behalf by our elected representatives who are there to act in our best interests. The budget, therefore, is a promissory note, if you will, that will outline funded actions to advance national development priorities, including gender equality priorities. And this third principle is the economic efficiency principle. Gender responsive budgeting requires the applications of tools and instruments that will introduce increased scrutiny. They will introduce increased accountability in relation to the management of the budget at every stage, from the formulation stage, where ideally questions should be asked around what is the problem being addressed, in this case, gender equality. Therefore, do we have sex disaggregated data to identify the nature of the problem? What is the impact of the problem, gender equality, on the population? How are women and men and boys and girls affected? What are the differences and disparities by ethnicity, by disability status? And what I've described to you is a gender responsive budgeting tool. What I've described to you is gender analysis, and is a very foundational first step in any gender responsive budgeting initiative. So this is the very first tool or step, gender analysis. And to continue, has any has an evidence-based gender-responsive policy been implemented? Is there a policy framework on gender equality in the country? Is there a strategic plan that has been costed to back up that policy to ensure that it's going to be implemented? And if so, is it financed? What are the plans to finance this policy? And so on. So there are procedures in place when we apply gender responsive budgeting to ensure that the expenditures linked to strategic interventions, strategic policy interventions to close gender inequality gaps are complied with. And so in countries that apply GRB, there's often a requirement that the budget circular integrate in their annual budget request how they are going to address gender equality and women's empowerment. So again, that's a tool for increased budget performance and transparency. And after the budget has been debated and approved and enacted as law, we then have to assess how the money is being spent and if the promises made to the people when that budget law was passed are actually being honored. In some countries, there's a gender budget statement. This is another tool that outlines each ministry's action, each agency's action to reduce gender inequality. It outlines the resources to be allocated and how these resources was spent, and it shows the commitments to gender equality in the entire budget. So Rwanda, Canada, and other countries that have long-standing gender-responsive budgeting initiatives do produce these gender budget statements. And this is critical in evaluating the performance of the budget. So these are tools. I mentioned gender analysis, I mentioned the call circular, I mentioned the gender budget statement. So these are examples of how GRB can enhance the performance of the budget. So in essence, GRB is a form of performance-based budgeting. And just to close, I'll say that our agency, UN Women, has done quite a lot to promote gender-responsive budgeting in the Caribbean. Specifically, UN Women has worked with the government of St. Lucia with mainstreaming gender into the national planning and budgeting cycle. And this led to the inclusion in St. Lucia's 2015-2016 first call circular with a directive to line ministries to include initiatives to eliminate gender bias in their annual budget request. In 2015, we continued engagement with finance and social policy officers from the OECS. This is how I actually met the Honorable Minister Marshall from Antigua and Barbuda, and we were able to engage with senior policymakers there on GRB. We continued this in Guyana, and then we continued this with the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, where we held several sessions on gender responsive budgeting. To close very quickly in terms of best practices, Rwanda has a national gender management system where gender is mainstreamed from the entire policy architecture of government, including its budgeting process. Morocco does as well. GRB can also be implemented at a municipal level. So for example, Mexico City, 75% of the Mexico City budget is now tied to implementing specific actions to promote human rights. And in Ecuador and Nepal, they have a GRB classification system where they are able to track and monitor how responsive their budget is to gender equality. So in closing, what I would say is that when we consider GRB, we have to look at how the budget can be a tool for promoting equity and equality, and there are distributional considerations, that is who is benefiting and who is not benefiting, is necessary for national development and the achievement of gender equality, and GRB can help in monitoring these distributional considerations, i.e. who isn't benefiting and who isn't. So I'll stop there, and I hope I've contributed in some way to increasing an understanding of what gender responsive budgeting is and how it can be a tool for increased accountability and transparency and governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ishua. That was very useful, and I think what I take away from that is how the commitments that governments make to gender, just as we spoke a month ago about the Sustainable Development Goals, that if they're not backed up in the budget, then they are unlikely to yield any results at all. So it's about making budgets responsive to all, men and women, boys and girls, to make them an effective economic instrument. So thank you very much for that presentation. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions once all the presenters have spoken, so thank you. I'm now particularly delighted to introduce our second speaker, the Honourable Bridget Anisette-George, Member of Parliament and Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker is the second female in the history of Trinidad and Tobago to hold that noble office, and she also serves as chairman of the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee, an important committee which we heard much about at the first webinar. Madam Speaker is an attorney at law. She has held several distinguished positions, including Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as Commissioner of both the Port Authority and the Securities and Exchange Commission of Trinidad and Tobago. It is a pleasure to have Honourable Anisette-George back with us again for another webinar in this series. Madam Speaker, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stadden, and all protocols observed. Good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to again participate in another of these webinars, which I think is really very important for us in the discharge of our functions as legislators. As legislators, we all know that however the budget is defined, that it is really the primary mechanism by which the executive finances and affects its fiscal policy. In fact, the budget brings plans into reality. And I really found a very interesting perspective about the budget in an article done by the OECD, which says that sound budgeting is not just a fiscal instrument, but it engenders trust among citizens that the executive, the government, is listening to their concerns and has plans to achieve those concerns in a wholesome way with the available resources effectively, efficiently, ensuring improved quality of life and delivery of services. We as legislators also well know what our role is as legislators when it comes to the budget. We enact the budget, and after we monitor its implementation. And during the enactment stage, I think questions really engage our minds in terms of, while the budget may speak to all, it's really rather a question of whether the budget sufficiently caters for all our constituents. We then look to examine how the budget works through its life cycle. What data is presented by the government to support proposals and decisions, and to assist us as legislators to scrutinize the executive. And then, you know, in the context of gender responsive budgeting, and in the context also of listening to the concerns of our citizens, we also have to be concerned with whether there are gendered lenses being applied to the formulation and implementation of the budget to ensure not just only efficiency and value for money, but to ensure equality in the budget for our constituencies, our citizens, every woman, every man, every boy, every girl. Now, in terms of, and the first speaker made the point that all our countries are signatories to the Paris Accord. They have all made commitments to Agenda 2030. And particularly Goal 5, which is the gender equality goal, and Goal 10, reducing inequalities. And I support the first speaker in the view that gender responsive budgeting is really a fundamental mechanism to ensure the realization of these two goals. In fact, gender responsive budget is a budget that works for all men, women, girls, boys, because it ensures gender equitable distribution of resources. Now, in the approach to gender responsive budgeting, as the first speaker indicated, there are many tools. And, you know, the tools range from Like in Rwanda and Australia, there being a call circular, very detailed court circular, setting out certain commitments for funding. Or there may be pre-budget debates and guidelines and laws which promote gender equality, like in France, Brazil, and Sweden. While some countries actually have a budget office to support the work and clearly defined the gender budgeting mechanisms. We in our country and in Trinidad and Tobago, and I guess in all other countries of the region, we know that there is the pre-budget process where the draft budget is established by the call circular from the Ministry of Finance. There are discussions with ministries and so on. Then it moves to the legislative process. That's where we get involved as parliamentarians, where the budget is tabled, it's debated. In our jurisdiction, it goes to the Standing Finance Committee, which is a 5-day process of looking at the budget items line by line. And then eventually the budget is passed. I know in theory we say we amend, we could reject, but we know generally the budget as drafted is accepted. We then go on to the implementation stage where we look at how the budget and the appropriation of funds, how they are released and how they are implemented by the various ministries. And then, of course, we know at the end of the budget cycle, there is the audit by the Auditor General, and subsequently reports come to the Public Accounts Committee. In our jurisdiction, we have both a Public Accounts Committee and a Public Accounts Enterprises Committee. Now, we in our Parliament were convinced of the critical importance of gender responsive budgeting, particularly in terms of monitoring our commitments by our government to the Sustainable Development Goals, and in this context, Sustainable Development Goal 5 and Sustainable Development Goal 10. We did not have the environment as exists in, say, Rwanda, Australia, or Brazil. And our approach really was an intervention through our Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, which is established under Standing Order 102 of our House of Representatives and Standing Order 90 of our Senate. And our Public Accounts Committee considers and reports to the House on the budgetary expenditure of government agencies to ensure that expenditure is embarked upon in accordance with parliamentary approval. So what we really did is we intervened at the stage of training and capacity development. And what we sought to do was to introduce the concept of gender responsive budgeting, building skills, building capacity of our parliamentarians and our staff, and particularly the members of our financial scrutiny committees. In March of 2019, we hosted, in conjunction with the United Nations Women, a training session, a 3-day training session under the rubric of Gender Responsive Budgeting, a tool for advancing parliamentary oversight and accountability for the 2030 Agenda and the Trinidad and Tobago Agenda 2030. And during that 3-day training session, our parliamentarians and our staff were exposed to concepts of what is gender budgeting, looking at the characteristics of gender responsive budgeting, the budget formulation stage, the budget debate stage, the instruments of gender responsive budgeting, the integration of gender in the national finance and budget laws, and gender responsive budgeting and the role of parliamentarians. It became clear to us that having gone through the training, that yes, we had to make an intervention, and how should we make this intervention? And in asking that, we looked at certain questions we asked of ourselves. For instance, is gender integrated into our national budgeting process? And if it is, how is that done? How is it integrated? How do our ministries intend to change budgets to promote gender equality if gender responsive budgeting is not integrated in the processes? So we decided that we would host a written inquiry with the Ministry of Finance and our Ministry of Planning and Development, because we felt that an intent not supported by finance remained only an intent, and that the Ministry of Finance needed to see itself as part and parcel of the whole commitment to gender equality. So we held this seminar, this inquiry with both the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Planning and Development, and questions were posed to them. It was interesting that a response was to the question whether gender is integrated into the national budgeting process. The response was, the national budgeting process is prescribed in the annual call circular prepared by the Ministry of Finance. While there are no specific guidelines in the call circular with regard to gender equality, it is implied that the resources provided will be utilized for the provisions of goods and services to the community at large without discrimination based on gender. Then we asked, who is involved in the decision making about the relevant policies and budgets, and how are men and women represented? And the response was, policy decisions which are translated into budgets are made largely by the government, which is comprised of duly elected representatives of people of Trinidad and Tobago. These representatives are elected by both men and women, and therefore gender bias is not practiced in the elective process in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And I guess that was the response, to say that men and women are catered for in the budget. So having regard to the sort of answers we got, we felt that our intervention needed to come from our continued inquiry process, and therefore that our PAAC would begin through its inquiry of the various ministries to look at their programs and their plans and see how those programs and plans are financed and what are the impacts on men and women, boys and girls. Admittedly, one needs disaggregated data. That really doesn't exist. But we felt that by conducting our inquiries in a particular type of way, we would then be able to make recommendations. Recommendations which would therefore seek to address how are the plans and programs impacting men and women? How do your budgets address the inequalities? How do you measure your success, your impacts? And therefore, as a solution, we are continuing that sort of inquiry process built into any sort of inquiry that the PAAC does while looking at the implementation of the budget. We continue with training of our parliamentarians. We have included our accounting officers of the various ministries in the training with respect to gender responsive budgeting. We also have been formulating gender inclusive and gender sensitive recommendations to all our stakeholders who appear before us. And of course, in our inquiry process, we are including gender sensitive questions to all our witnesses who come before us. And we are going to continue monitoring the implementation of gender responsive budgeting initiatives by ministries and departments. Acknowledging that we're not yet like Rwanda, our hope is that our intervention at this stage of the budget's implementation and the recommendations, which when our recommendations are made, our ministries are required to respond to our recommendations, and we do follow up on our recommendations. So it's our hope that by analyzing the programs that ministries implement and execute, and by looking at the budgets that support these programs, that gender responsive budgeting will become part and parcel of what our ministries do. It is so that our recommendations will effect changes in their programs and their budgets, making them more gender responsive, and that incrementally gender will be mainstreamed into the national planning and budgeting processes. For example, that there will be introduced gender-related strategies and gender-related strategic objectives, that there will be impact assessments of expenditure on programs and on gender equality, and that better data collection will begin by our central statistical agencies and also by ministries in their rollout of their programs, so that we will be better able to do gender analysis. So in a way, we're starting from bottom up rather than there being a government policy, and hoping that through our PAAC, we drive gender responsive budgeting into our budgeting, planning, and financial processes. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Two very interesting presentations. I think the point about integrating gender considerations over all stages of the budget cycle, from the budget circular to audit, considerations of value for money. We talk about economy, effectiveness, efficiency, but also adding perhaps equity to those considerations as well. So thank you very much. And for all the participants, just to repeat that once the speakers are done, we will take questions. So if you have any questions, please do type them into the chat so we can make a start immediately after the four speakers have finished. I'd now like to introduce Honourable Samantha Marshall Mp. She's the Minister of Aquaculture, Fisheries and Barbuda Affairs since her appointment in January 2020. She is an attorney at law with over 20 years experience. She was first elected to the lower house of the Parliament of Antigua and Barbuda in June 2014, and was also appointed as a member of the Cabinet with responsibility for the Ministry of Social Transformation and Human Resource Development, Youth and Gender Affairs. Minister Marshall is currently one of two elected females of the majority in the lower house, as well as in the Cabinet of Antigua and Barbuda. Minister, thank you again for your hospitality in hosting me here today, this morning in the ministry, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Let me take this opportunity first and foremost to say good morning to my fellow panelists and of course our distinguished guest. Let me also thank the Caribbean Development Bank, CDB, in partnership with the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and the Parliament of Barbados and the CARICAD and Dodds Group Limited for inviting all of the panelists, including myself, to be a part of this crucial dialogue in which we have the opportunity to share and address some of the most critical issues to our socio-economic development as a region and most importantly, as a people, particularly as it relates to reducing inequalities through gender responsive and more so socially inclusive government budgetary policies. I will not be repetitive because much of what Madam Speaker has referred to in terms of the process is very much the same here within Antigua and Barbuda. but I want to focus on the whole issue of scrutiny. And before I begin, I want to refer to a former member of the British Parliament, I believe it was Robin Cook, who said, good scrutiny makes for good government. And so I will have that as my beginning before I move right in now to my presentation. So when we're looking at budgets, who are we targeting of a proposed policy? And who will benefit? And also who will lose out? As policymakers, it is important for us to understand all groups are not impacted in the same way. Some groups confront barriers that prevent them from fully participating in political, economic, and social life. Therefore, it is necessary for us to use evidence-based decision-making to target the most vulnerable populations in national policies, budgets, and programming. However, given budgetary constraints within countries, drawing on existing national and international commitments assists with advancing gender equality and social inclusion. Advocating for concrete actions to target and benefit the most vulnerable should be anchored in a clear link to policies and commitments that the country has already made, such as in international commitments, for example, at the CEDAW for gender equality and women's rights and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, national legal frameworks or development strategies, such as to include the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Right now, we are witnessing the widening of systemic inequalities and significant budget constraints with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is even more critical for us to assess the differential impact and ensure that groups who are traditionally excluded, such as persons with disabilities, our youth, children, the elderly, women, and indigenous populations benefit from proposed policy actions. If we do not promote social inclusion, the exclusion of those who are historically disadvantaged will only lead to long-term social and economic costs to the individuals and, of course, by large, to the country. So who makes decisions to help ensure inclusive budgets? Who is involved in development of solutions or policies? Who is represented from civil society? Have women, youth, persons with disabilities been involved? Policymakers must ensure that there is a participatory budget process which is promoted and should include a focus on inclusive growth. This means that in addition to focusing on the desirability of broad-based growth across various economic sectors and the outcomes for vulnerable people, focus should also be placed on ensuring non-discriminatory participation in the growth process by large segments of the population. We need to focus on policy reform to address exclusionary practices, institutional alongside financial investments, and participation in the budget process. This can be done through a strengthening of the oversight of the budget process and participation by beneficiaries to improve the national budget's focus on meeting the needs of the vulnerable populations. Within Antigua and Barbuda, civil society organizations, including youth groups, women's groups, persons with disabilities, and the elderly, are now given an opportunity to participate in setting the agenda and helping to guide the relevant ministries with the determining factors for national budget priorities. This is done through consultation with all the relevant stakeholders. It is for the ministries to ensure that the agenda or the priorities are set accordingly before final presentation. However, just as in any other system, we could strengthen this because budgets for disability and the elderly are almost always entirely restricted or targeted expenditure on the social services and social protection programs. But social inclusion should be promoted across every single sector. In Antigua and Barbuda, civil society organizations, as I said, have an opportunity to influence the budget process through various consultations with sectors and aligned ministries. For instance, within the Ministry of Agriculture, the budget process for the ministry is informed by the inputs of various farmers associations and groups who comprise of women farmers, youth, migrant workers, unemployed individuals, small businesses, and associations. We have now extended that to ensure that we reach out. We have broadened our group to even reach out to the disabled so that we can ensure they're a part of the process also. But what about at the constituency level? Do they have any role? Do they play any part in the consultation process? And it is that at the constituency level, regular and consistent community consultation should be held with various groups, which include the representative body of individuals, vulnerable populations that you seek to represent. It is also important to provide capacity building and support to civil society and the government actors to participate meaningfully as partners in the budget process. At every stage of the budget cycle, stakeholders must feel empowered and supported to engage in dialogue and advocate for accountability and transparency, reform, implementation, and enforcement of public policies from rights-based approach. So civil society engagement throughout the budget cycle, what would that look like? You would be, I'm going to highlight about 9 points quickly, because you would want to ensure that there is gender equality to advance socioeconomic equality for women and girls and promote equality of women in leadership. You would also want to ensure people with disabilities have equal opportunities, promote integration and ensure a fair, inclusive society for minority groups, accessibility to health and well-being services, equality of access to education, equality to access housing, and provide early intervention through children and youth services. Create a safer and equal society for all. And lastly, support those in lower socioeconomic groups to provide better access to opportunities. How are resources distributed? Who provides the resources? Who uses the resources? Resources are distributed primarily based upon how you structure your business plan for your ministry and how you indicate your priorities based upon national policy development. Who provides the resources? Well, the resources come through the main channel of finance. Or if we are working with NGOs, whether locally or regionally or internationally, we are able to access additional funding to support such budgeting. Who uses the resources? The resources should be used specifically for the purposes that they have been given, and there should be accountability. I just want to give a key takeaway. Within Antigua and Barbuda, we innovatively created a parliamentary-based group for the very first time called the Network of Women Parliamentarians in Antigua and Barbuda. This group recently concluded setting up the Antigua and Barbuda Parliamentary Gender Caucus to ensure that the country's laws are reformed and incorporate gender and social inclusion. In fact, we had our first official sitting of reviewing legislation, which we believe which we are lobbying for change to ensure that they are more gender sensitive and have the necessary budgeting. And we had that first sitting about 3 weeks ago. It is unlike select committee, current parliamentarians work alongside cross-party with ex-parliamentarians, prospective parliamentarians, and stakeholders, scrutinizing the law and policy and making the necessary recommendations for amendment and greater support and budgeting elements. These are the things that can be done to help support and to ensure that we are able to better scrutinize and support civil society agenda in terms of meeting the vulnerable population and ensuring that there's gender responsive budgeting. In closing, another example, I note that for Antigua and Barbuda, we were not as sensitive to GBR at one point, and there was a recent project which came through the CDB for a road program. And I know that CDB opened the eyes to that ministry in understanding the importance of GBR. And so they had to, from since then, that has set the bar for any project that we are doing to ensure that it is gender responsive and that budgeting is allocated appropriately in that regard to ensure equality. These are the areas that we have to focus on. But as I said, there is also a need for social inclusion budgeting, and priorities should not only be isolated in a single ministry responsible for social development, but it is vital that all sectors and ministries do adopt approaches to promote social inclusion, citizen engagement, and a robust gender responsive budgetary system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Marshall, for another very interesting presentation. I know that our final speaker, the Honourable Christopher Coy, has to leave very shortly, so I'll go straight over to Senator Coy, who has over 20 years of experience in law. He's a past chairman of the Integrity Commission and has worked with the International Financial Services Commission as a member and served as president of the Belize International Financial Services Association and director of International Financial Services Division at the Belize Bank International Limited. Since November 2020, Senator Coy has held the position of Minister of State in the Ministries of Finance, Economic Development and Investment for the Government of Belize. And I know that Honourable Coy, that although he may have to leave, if there are any questions, he will answer them in writing, and we will distribute them after the webinar. So, Honourable Coy, over to you.
Hi, good morning. Madam Speaker, parliamentarians, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Before sharing my thoughts from the finance standpoint, I want to first thank the CDB for its leadership in funding and offering this webinar, a component of its public expenditure scrutiny for MPs project. The CDB continues to lead the way in our region with technical cooperation and financing. Second, I want to thank my fellow MPs for engaging in these opportunities where we share with and learn from each other. Together, we serve our people better. In signing on to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and committing to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their related targets, governments reaffirm that we are determined to end poverty and hunger in all their forms and dimensions, and to ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and in a healthy environment. In seeking the people's vote to form a new government in November last year, the People's United Party, in its Plan Belize manifesto, pledged to lead for sustained growth and prosperity for all Belizeans. As members of Parliament, and in some of our cases as members of the executive, it is now our responsibility to ensure that those commitments are operationalized and kept. At the same time, when looking at the topic I was asked to speak on, that is using parliamentary powers to focus government on the individual and her economic empowerment, it left me concerned that we would not be of much assistance. The havoc wreaked on Belize by fiscal mismanagement, the disproportionate effects of climate change, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic and its severe adverse economic fallout, is unprecedented in Belize's history as an independent nation. We find ourselves on the precipice of social and economic catastrophe. Belize is ranked the 6th most indebted nation with a 127% debt to GDP ratio, with a poverty rate exceeding 50% pre-COVID, and suffering one of the most severe economic contractions in the Western Hemisphere. Belize is the 8th ranked country out of 167 for climate risk, and according to the Climate Change Policy Assessment, among small states, Belize ranked 3rd at risk for natural disasters and 5th at risk from climate change. Belize's annual average losses from weather events during 1990 through 2008 equal on average close to 4% of GDP per year. Given these realities, where the majority of us have been relegated below the poverty line, rather than taking a micro approach, we have been placed into survival mode, where we have had to focus on core macro fiscal management fundamentals as a priority. These have included restructuring and reducing our debt, bringing government expenditure to more sustainable levels, while at the same time being more forceful and efficient at collecting government revenues. We have had to make tough decisions in this regard, including reducing salaries of public officers by 10% and slashing government expenditures by 20%. We are also taking steps to improve public expenditure management, which should lead to more efficient use of government funds. This includes centralizing public procurement and establishing effective internal audit controls. On the revenue end, we are in the process of strengthening tax administration and have launched a fully online tax registration, filing, and payment platform. With the assistance of CARTA, we have established a tax recovery unit to recover and address the problems of outstanding arrears. Through our Ministry of E-Governance, we are undertaking a comprehensive digitization process to provide efficient and better government services to our population. On the debt restructuring end, through a blue bond debt for marine conservation swap, for which we are currently seeking parliamentary approval this week, we are restructuring over 35% of our external debt, which will result in a debt reduction of over $250 million and an immediate reduction of our debt to GDP ratio by 12%. Other debt restructuring and debt reduction will shortly be achieved. To support our economic recovery and transformation, we have taken decisive steps through Parliament to foster and enable access to cheaper finance through several means. By amending the Central Bank Act to enable it to take Fed-style quantitative measures, $50 million is being made available to provide financial support in the form of low-interest loans to existing businesses, including COVID-impacted MSMEs. Through government's $30 million equity investment and IDB loan funding of $30 million being approved by Parliament, together with $10 million to be loaned by Taiwan's ICDF, our Development Finance Corporation is being enabled with the financial wherewithal to provide COVID recovery support to MSMEs. A minimum of 25% of the IDB loan funds, while 100% of the Taiwan loan funds will be loaned to women-owned businesses. While urgent action had to be taken to arrest the economic fallout and turn around our economic future, the government fully acknowledges the vital need for planning. In this regard, the government has initiated development of the Plan Belize Medium-Term Development Strategy 2021 to 2025, which will guide and set targets for social, economic, and environmental development over the next 5 years. The participation and buy-in of key stakeholders in every step of this medium-term strategy is of utmost importance, for it is here that we set and align those sustainable development targets that we committed to achieve. Key stakeholders guiding the development of this strategy include representatives from a broad spectrum of interests, including finance, economic development, sustainable development, climate change and disaster risk management, human development, education, families and indigenous peoples affairs, investment, the business community, the NGO sector, political parties, as well as direct citizen consultations. This medium-term strategy plan, once completed, will undoubtedly inform on budgetary planning to address socio-economic concerns, including but not limited to gender equality in education and in the workplace, and individual economic upliftment policies. Clearly, this administration believes in economic empowerment through economic opportunity and is taking every action it can to provide such opportunities. But as one of my colleagues aptly put it, we have to create wealth in order to redistribute wealth. So the goal through both the executive and the legislature is to provide the opportunity to create wealth on an equitable and gender-sensitive basis, and to consider how we redistribute wealth on a similar basis without creating perverse incentives. To wrap up and to try to connect the challenging economic realities that our government faces to the question of how members of Parliament can provide better scrutiny and oversight in terms of inclusive budgets, I believe we all recognize that the best place to start is for each of us to do our part to ensure fiscal prudence and efficiency through proper oversight and accountability, so that we can stretch our resources to go beyond covering the survival basics and be able to invest in real, equitable, and sustainable development. Forgive me if I had not provided you a more specific listing of monitoring and scrutinizing tools, but I believe that one of the key takeaways from our experience is to truly grasp how much our constituency forego and lose when we are not prudent and responsible stewards of the resources they place in our custody. Appreciating our realities and creating the right macro environment, both on the fiscal and the monetary side in the context of those realities, with focused short, medium, and long-term planning, facilitates diversified economic opportunity on a broader, more inclusive basis that ultimately provides economic empowerment equitably to more people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Coy, for the presentation and for explaining the steps that are being taken in Belize to ensure social inclusion. We've had 4 very rich and informative presentations. We now have about 10-15 minutes for questions. Please put them on the chat or raise your hand. As time is against us, I'm going to read out the first question, which is for Madam Speaker. It's from Kimberly Gilbert. And the question, Madam Speaker, is: following the gender responsive budgeting training conducted with parliamentarians in 2019, has she noticed any adaptation of principles from this training in the recent budget? So I hope you've got that okay. And whilst I give you a second to capture your thoughts, I'd also would like to ask a question to Honourable Marshall. I was very interested about, we talked about social inclusion, and as part of that is actually the importance of participation. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you reach out to those communities to ensure that their voices are heard in budgetary discussions, because we hear lots in other countries about how sometimes it's captured by the usual suspects, but how you go out to those marginalised communities. So perhaps if I go to Madam Speaker first, and then I will go to Minister Marshall. So Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much for the question. Certainly in terms of the interrogation of the budget, we have seen that our members have asked certain targeted questions in terms of catering for inequalities that may have been experienced by women and girls in certain areas. Then again, the issue is that when you look at it in terms of the budget in itself is not presented in that way. There is already a set format for how the budget is presented by the Minister of Finance. But certainly in terms of the debate, you do hear gender sensitive questions being asked, and certainly in our Standing Finance Committee, when we go through the budget items line by line, I have heard questions. It's a pity I can't pull a particular one, but I have heard questions being asked that seeks to interrogate the figures or the plans or the budgeted item in terms of how would it address a perceived or a given inequality. I think the important thing is that we're beginning to accept that gender neutrality is not something to be proud of. Gender neutrality means that the built-in biases exist and may be becoming more entrenched. And I think that is a good starting point. You know, there was a stage where people thought that gender, from gender, women, what more they want? But I think the point issue I made is that apart from it looking to address inequalities, it really aims at an efficient and effective use of limited resources. All resources are limited, and therefore using gender responsive budgeting approach makes you target specific inequalities and address them with your limited resources.
Thank you very much. Honourable Marshall, and after Honourable Marshall, I have a question also for issuer. I wonder whether you can talk a little bit about any experiences you've had, preferably within the region, about the importance of social audits and how they've been used in terms of seeing the effectiveness of gender-based programs. But Honourable Marshall first.
Sure, thank you very much for that question. Let me first indicate, and perhaps I should have highlighted earlier, that we do have a social protection legislation which was passed in 2020. This had been in the works for some period of time, and it has a cross section of persons who serve on the commission, who look after the interest or to pay focus on the interests of the vulnerable populations. But in addition to that, we do have a register of most of the civil organizations through different ministries or sectors, and it is today that we would engage through consultations, reach out through consultations to advise as to legislation that we believe may have some impact on them, and to have their input in that regard. Also for them to indicate what are the challenges and constraints that they would have, so that you may look at the whole budgetary cycle and see how you're able to assist through that process also. So by virtue of the fact that we have the Social Protection Act, we are mandated thereunder to ensure that we engage the vulnerable communities as much as possible through all angles. We are legislatively obliged to do so.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. Just remind, we still have a little bit of time. We can, I think, with the presenter's indulgence, we can go a little bit over time as well. We have a question from Dr. Benicia Nisbet. Perhaps what I'll do is I'll ask Dr. Nisbet to ask the question, then I will ask Ishima to respond about social minutes, social audit, and then the panelists can respond to this question. So can I ask Dr. Benicia Nisbet to pose the question, please? Dr. Nisbet, are you there?
Hi, good morning to everyone. Yes, honestly, I do not have any question at this moment, but I was just making commendation on all the presenters. I am new to Parliament. This is my first year in Parliament. I'm the youngest member of Parliament in St. Kitts and Nevis, so I am just here to gain knowledge and use that to strengthen myself. So at this point, no question, but just commendation. Thanks all the presenters for presenting. Okay.
Thank you.
That's fine. It's good to hear that, and I think what the Honourable Minister, Honourable Marshall, spoke about the network of creating networks of parliamentarians, women parliamentarians. I think that can be very useful for new members. When I worked at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, they had the network of Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians, which I think is a very powerful network, and they've also, CPA has created other networks for young new parliamentarians, members with disabilities as well, which I think can be a very useful tool. Ishwa, can I come back to you in terms of any, can you give any examples of the value of social audits within the region, if possible?
Thank you for that question, Anthony. While we haven't had direct experience in the region with conducting social audits for a GRB imperative, if you will, there are examples of interventions that we have supported that I would say are very closely aligned to a social audit and will achieve the same purpose. For example, in St. Lucia, we undertook, or we supported the government of St. Lucia with undertaking a gender analysis of its public assistance program. The purpose of that audit, if you will, even if it wasn't called that, was to really understand how men access the program and what were the operational barriers to accessing the program and how women were accessing the program. The objective was to see if there were any gender differentials in terms of access to services and so on, and whether the system was responsive. The intent was to use these results to inform the development of the social protection policy, the operations manual, a costed national social protection strategy that would respond to the results of this study. So while there isn't in a traditional sense, when, you know, if you look at the GRB practice social audit that has been done, this is an example of how you can deploy, if you will, gender analysis to inform what could, to inform policy, and then of course to ensure that that policy is costed and financed and so on. I would say that the social audit is a necessary step. There's no one way, I think, to conduct a social audit. That's the other point I want to make. Madam Speaker, I really want to commend you for the work that you have been doing, because as I was listening to you, that is the form, if you will, of a social audit. You are starting inquiries, discussions in the Parliament with the public, if you will, or with the architecture of government to say what is actually happening with the budget. The parliamentarians are asking questions with a gender lens. and in a way, this is an audit, if you will, using parliamentary tools and using parliamentary mechanisms, right, with a social imperative in mind. So that's my response. I hope I answered your question, and I think, yeah, so I think we continue to support in the best way we can and to promote gender equality and using GRB as a mechanism for that.
Exactly.
Thank
and
you.
I think, as you say, there's a variety of different tools that can be used that fall under the banner of, and it's what works in particular jurisdictions is what matters. And we have two participants with their hands up. I think this may well be our final before we wrap up. So can I go to is Amrita Dianarine and Hazel Thompson I. So perhaps if I can go to Amrita Dianarine, apologies for my pronunciation. Would you like to make your comment or question, please?
Hi, good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask this question. I must first of all commend the entire panel. This was very useful and a very intriguing presentation from all panel members. My question, however, is to the Honorable Minister Coy. I noticed that you made special mention of improvements in tax administration in Belize as part of your economic development agenda going forward. My question was really, how do you expect these improvements in tax administration to assist in revenue management and improving the whole budgeting exercise in your country? And also, maybe this might be a little bit off the topic that we are discussing here today, but I'm interested to know how come a revenue authority model was not used to improve tax administration, and you know, the types of mechanisms that are being used to improve tax administration, to improve budgeting in your country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for, I think, two questions there. Minister Coy has had to leave after his presentation. But what we will do and what he's promised is that we will make sure that these questions reach him, and we will ensure that there will be a written response which is distributed to the participants. So thank you for your question, and we will make sure that it is answered. Can I turn to Hazel Thompson I think you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the Honorable Samantha Marshall on your network of women parliamentarians. I have heard you on your discrimination against, you know, and equality and all of those very nice policy reforms. But I can't help wondering though, because we usually focus on the women, whether when you're talking about equal access, that you consider also the men, and in your policy reform and your law reform and your input into budgetary concerns, that you think also of like providing shelters for men who are both perpetrators and victims of domestic violence, that you ensure that your laws also provide for men who are in fact the mainstay of the family, providing for the families in terms of the children, that they also have access to maintenance in the courts. And if they do, that they are also aware that there is no shame in going to the court and asking that court to provide, because I've come across many men who are in fact, you know, doing the role of women, of mothers and fathers, and they don't always have the necessary support. Not all women are shrinking violence and victims. There are some quite aggressive and behaving quite badly, I must say. So we have to always remember that the men are not all ogres. There are some wonderful men out there doing the best for their children. And as parliamentarians, we must ensure that they are protected and provided for.
Thank you. I know the chairman is smiling. let me just say that yes, although when we tend to speak about gender, we tend to look at women. But I would like to make it very clear that all the programs and policies do also pertain to men. In fact, in 2017, Antigua and Barbuda opened its first ever support and referral center, which is a support center dealing with victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence. And you would be surprised through that campaign as to sensitization and education of the support that is provided there. We had a number of men who would come and utilize the services or ask for assistance in being able to access other services that were relevant to them. So I just want to make it very clear. Yes, we do have men who access the services, and we are not inconsiderate and do not ensure that the rights and interests of men are also protected. We look after our men, our boys, our girls, and our women. But as you know, traditionally, or should I say most societies, the greater impact is upon our girls and our women. But when we speak of gender here in Antigua and Barbuda, it is all inclusive.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Well, we're 5 minutes over time, so I think what I'll do now is I will wrap up and thank the panelists. But just to, in terms of our understanding of when we talk about gender now, just to echo what the minister and indeed the speakers have said, is that when we talk about gender, it's holistically we're talking about men and women. And indeed, in my own country, big discussions over the last few years about paternity rights. And that again is looking at gender, asking those questions about the rights and the if you like the budget that for men to have time with their newborn as well. But I think one of the I took a note of the quotation, "Good scrutiny makes for good government," by Robin Cook. It's a lovely quote, and it links back, I think, to the first webinar when we talked about financial scrutiny. What is it for? And it's of course for people, but it's also about making government effective and having impact and results. And I think one of the key messages from the four speakers today is about taking consideration of distribution of the impact, who's benefiting from the budget and who isn't. Men, women, girls, boys, young, old, and if it's if you're asking these questions in the national budget, it's necessary for national development, and it's key if the Sustainable Development Goals are to be met. And so I think some very powerful messages, and I thank the four speakers for their time and for their rich presentation. So thank you, Ishua, thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you, Honourable Minister, Honourable Marshall, for your presentations and for your time today. And in his absence, let me also thank Minister of State Coy as well. We do have one further webinar in this series. It's a 3-webinar series. The final webinar will be on Wednesday, November the 24th. At 10 o'clock. It is entitled Public Service Ethos and a National Integrity System. So we'll be bringing in, looking at the importance of public service ethos, looking at things such as anti-corruption strategies and creating national, strong, robust integrity systems. So thank you again for our three speakers. There will be a survey launched at the end of the event, so you'll be asked some questions. There'll be an opportunity to give comments about what future webinars what topics you would like to have in the future. And indeed, if you have any questions, I'm sure if you put them on the chat, we'll make sure that we send them to the speakers with their indulgence. I'm sure that they will agree to respond. So thank you again. Thank you to the CDB. Thank you to Dodds, and I look forward to listening next time to the third webinar on Wednesday, November the 24th. And the final is that the CDB are also preparing 3 online videos of assistance for parliamentarians in their scrutiny of the budget, and we expect them to be ready, I think, in end of November or December. And we hope that it will be a rich resource for parliamentarians to use, and as part of their key constitutional responsibilities of scrutiny of the budget for the benefit of all their peoples. So thank you very much for your participation, and I look forward to the next webinar next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.